Both the biggest surprise and the biggest disappointment for me during this pandemic time, these unusual eras that we're living in, has been not so much the lockdown itself, but the response of people to the lockdown. It's been the lack of critical thinking, the lack of questioning, the bland acceptance of whatever the government has said to be absolutely true, to be our best way out of it. But an even bigger problem is a population which shown itself to be more willing to take orders than it is to question those orders, to look behind them to see what the best thing really is for them and their families. It seems to me that we take an awful lot on trust as a society, and that's been, as I say, quite a shock to me. I haven't realised that the vast majority of people in the country would just do as they were told, even if what they're told is completely alien to their normal way of life and the loss of all of their freedoms. I expected, I suppose, a lot more. I teach a whole pile of students how to think for themselves and how they should not take anybody's word for it. And yet we live in a world where we seem to take people's word for almost everything simply because they say so. The majority of people feel that the government is absolutely right in what it does. Not because I think that they're persuaded by the arguments necessarily, but simply because it's like a kind of a big uncle or maybe a big brother that tells them what's best for them. And they just take that on board and they just believe it and they don't ask any questions. I suppose that's been also for me a big shake-up on my thoughts about democracy too. If people are willing to just accept authoritarianism and the loss of their freedoms because a big government says so, then are they the right kind of people to make the kind of decisions that they need to in order to choose governments? And it certainly raises the question that if people are so easily manipulated, whether by propaganda or by psychological techniques, many adverts on the television and on the radio telling us exactly what to think, what not to do, to be thankful for the small freedoms that we've been given, and not to abuse them, as if those freedoms were not ours anymore, but were dispensed to us by a benign and benevolent government who only has our best interests at heart. I'd have thought that democracy might have been a good safeguard against that, and it doesn't seem to be. It seems to me that we have an uncritical public. If you have an uncritical society, then democracy doesn't really produce the best government at all. But then I suppose, at the end of the day, that's really not what democracy is about. Democracy is not about producing the best government. I don't think that's the best argument for democracy. I think the real argument for democracy, and why I wouldn't jettison it, because I think it's, as Churchill said, a very inadequate and poor system, but it's the best one that we've got. Nevertheless, I think it's the best one we've got simply for this reason alone. That is that everybody should have a say in who governs them. Even if their ideas or their thoughts or their critical faculties or their abilities to think through issues, even if it's not very acute or very sharp, nevertheless, everybody, no matter what their state or their wisdom or their intelligence or their background or their abilities or whoever they may be, everyone has the same right to determine who it is who makes the laws that govern their behaviour. And ultimately that has to be the bedrock of a free society, that you get to choose what kind of lawmakers are going to affect your life. Because after all, they do affect you, and they do affect what you can do and what you can't do. In this country, we've always had a system whereby you were free to do anything you liked to do unless the government made a law that said to say that you couldn't. But this pandemic has changed that on its head. It now appears we live in a society whereby you're not allowed to do anything at all unless the government gives you permission to do it. And if that's what the people want, if that's what they vote for, then I suppose that's the kind of government that we all deserve.